And here's Sean.
All right. Now that everybody is officially here in their virtual space, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. I would like to welcome everyone who has made it out to this event and definitely acknowledge our panelists for this evening. Yes, it's a good Tuesday when you get 3 police chiefs in the same Zoom room. Lucky us. All right. So greetings again to everyone. My name is Dr. Talia Moore, and I am the Undergraduate Criminology Program Coordinator, as well as an assistant professor here at Holy Names University. I would like to welcome everyone to this event and thank you all genuinely for taking the time out to be in attendance, to listen, to learn, and to be a part of this exchange and opportunity to share ideas. I am delighted and privileged to have our guest panelists. Just beside myself, I must admit, I have 3 Bay Area police chiefs representing Oakland Police Department. We have Chief LaRonne Armstrong, representing Fremont Police Department, Chief Sean Washington, and representing Piedmont Police Department, we have Chief Jeremy Bowers. They're sending in virtual applause as we speak. So please help me welcome our esteemed panelists, however you emote and share those good vibes. Today, we have the privilege of actually tackling some issues that we see, that we have experienced over time, and actually get leaders and people in positions who can inform us about the changes that are happening, the ways in which law enforcement is responding, and also to provide us with the vantage point of a person of color, a minority, a Black man, as we go through this ride and experience all of the many changes and facets in relation to policing and community engagement. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of my panelists to briefly introduce themselves. If you could share your name, again, the department that you hail from, and also if you could share, about a little bit about your career path as you evolved to this position. I will go in alphabetical order by last name, taking it back to the old school. So Chief Armstrong, you are first.
Can you? I'm trying to unmute, but I can't.
Oh, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay. My screen was frozen. Hi, I'm LaRonne Armstrong, Chief of Police for the Oakland Police Department.
And a little bit about yourself.
I'm born and raised in Oakland.
Oh, you went mute now.
When I try to, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm having some technical difficulties for some reason. It won't allow me to come off the mute, but again, been with the Oakland Police Department for over 23 years. Currently, obviously Chief of Police in Oakland. I've been at the job since February of this year. So 9 months, but it's been a busy 9 months, if you would. I'm born and raised in Oakland. I graduated from McClymonds High School. Have been a lifelong Oaklander, and really happy to be here this evening.
All right, thank you, Chief. Next, we'll go to Chief Bowers.
Thank you again, Dr. Moore, for the opportunity, and it's good to see my colleagues, Chief Armstrong and Chief Washington. And I wish I could see, the audience, because it's just such an honor to be able to have this discussion. And so we're making do, but definitely wish I could see the audience and appreciate their attendance tonight. My name is Jeremy Bowers, and I am the Chief of Police with the Piedmont Police Department. I've been in Piedmont since 2014, and I've been the chief since 2016. I can't believe it's been that amount of time already, but been here and moved up from the South Bay, and I'm a resident of Oakland, so I'm not a lifelong, not born and bred like Chief Armstrong, but definitely a proud Oakland resident since 2014. Prior to coming up to the East Bay, I spent about 18 years with the San Jose Police Department in the South Bay. So I've been in this business about 25 years now, and just basically rose up the ranks through San Jose. So I have that big city perspective, and really it's been interesting going from a large major city police department, biggest city in the Bay Area, to where I'm at now, which is one of the smallest. So definitely appreciate the partnership I have with my colleagues, but particularly with Oakland and Chief Armstrong and OPD. Huge partnership. And so again, looking forward to the conversation this evening. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you. All right. And lastly, but not least, Chief Washington.
Well, thank you, Dr. Moore, and I really appreciate the opportunity being here tonight. I always love these type of events to engage, especially with our youth and our young people, to share my perspective. So I am Sean Washington. I am the newly appointed chief of the Fremont Police Department. I've been on the job for about 3 weeks now. So I have 24 years overall experience here in Fremont. I've worked for only one agency, which I'm proud to represent, the South County, as my colleagues represent North County there. A little bit about me. I was actually born and raised in the Los Angeles area, so I don't have that Bay Area connection, although I've been up here for 24 years. But yes, I love my Lakers. Yes, I love my Dodgers, and I'm not ashamed to say it. So that's just a little bit about me. And again, I look forward to the evening of engagement.
All right. Thank you, Chief Washington. Thank you for that. All right. So now that we've had introductions, we have an idea of who our panelists are, a little bit about their background in relation to policing and their position. We're going to transition into the questions. I like to start with the top question, and then we work our way kind of down here. And if you all can recall what the questions may have looked like, you can know that that's really where we're going to start at. So I'm actually just going to ask questions, and if in a roundabout type of way, whomever feels they're able to respond, I encourage you all to. Please do. All right. So question number one, I should say, recall the summer of 2020, right? We all tried to forget that year, but let's run it back one time, right? And the massive protests that took place across the country following the officer-involved shootings of both George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. How did this impact your work? And really, how did this impact the work of your officers? Because this is a big moment in our law enforcement and community engagement history, if you will. And so how does this incident, even though it's thousands of miles away, what kind of impact do you see here with your officers and within your department?
I can go ahead and start, especially, being a new chief. I wasn't a chief at the time, but I must say that what we experienced last year was it was a gut punch to me as a professional, as well as our profession, right? So there's no call for what happened to Mr. Floyd. That is not what we are about as a profession. So with that said, it really was a time that our community and our nation demanded that law enforcement, we reevaluate how we're doing things. Every police department is made differently. Some have more challenges than others, but as a profession, I think it was time for us to look inward and see what more can we do to ensure things like this don't occur. So for me professionally, that is not what that particular incident does not represent this profession and what we stand for and the honor that's associated with this badge. But we have to take steps to try to prevent things like that from occurring in the future. So it forced us to have more engagement, to listen to our communities even more, to understand the concerns that the community, our communities that we serve have. And so with that came a lot of dialogue and a lot of calls for change that I know, especially the agencies that are represented here, have done some wonderful work in evolving the profession, right? So in our society, policing, it is an evolution. We are better today than we were just a few years ago, and we will be better a few years from now, 20 years from now. The profession will look and be different, and it will be better. And so we just have to keep that in mind, that change and an evolution in our profession is not a bad thing we should try to resist, but something we should embrace. We all want to get better. We all want to do better. So for me, that was my perspective once we dealt with everything that we dealt with last summer with the calls for protest and police reform. It was impactful for at least our agency, and we have a number of changes that we've implemented as a result.
Thank you, Chief Washington. That's actually good to hear. It's good to hear that there was a shift that occurred agency-wide. Chief Bowers, can you respond as well?
Yeah, Dr. Moore, you know, so I was a police chief at the time in the summer of 2020, and quite frankly, it's a time that I don't think anybody in the law enforcement profession or our society will ever forget. And it's important that we don't forget it because of what happened. So as a chief, I'll just tell you what happened with me. Number one is I started as a human being. And when I saw the images as a human being and as an African-American man, I had to look at what happened in as a human being, process it first and foremost. And it was emotional to see what had happened and just being in disbelief. And then as a leader, you know, it's about how am I going to lead not only my police department, but my community through what I just observed, and how am I as a law enforcement leader going to lead through what's going on. And so really what, as a law enforcement leader, you have to look at from that perspective is you have to be timely, you have to be direct, and you have to be communicative. And it's looking from a perspective of not just the community, but also internally as well. You have to look inside out. You have to look outside in. You have to look up and down your organization, and you have to be very nuanced in your strategic way you're going to deal with this issue. First and foremost, what I told my people is, number one, and I'm happy to say that, you know, the members of my department were horrified as well from what they saw and what they witnessed in the summer of 2020. But I had to make a very succinct statement to my organization. And I went into every one of my briefings, which fortunately for me in a small organization is easier for me to do than, say, a major city department. But I went into every briefing and I just flat out said, you know, listen, if what you saw in that video as a law enforcement professional, if what you saw in that video, if there's any way, shape, or form that you can justify or rationalize what you saw in that video, then what I need you to do is put your badge and your gun on my desk and move on to a different profession. And I said that to every single one of my briefings. And not only did I say it, but I also let the community know that I said it. Because that was a line that we just needed to put out there. And then from there, we went to work. As Chief Washington talked about, you know, I think organizations, certainly in the Bay Area, if not throughout the country, have taken an introspective look at how they do the things that they do. But let's be real, it's been stressful for everybody. It's been a reckoning for a lot of people, including in law enforcement. And so one of the things for me that I need in my organization to understand is that change is coming and change is here. And change isn't easy for everybody. And it's been stressful, as I said, for many folks, including folks within law enforcement. And so if we're gonna hope to continue to move the needle on reforming policing, it's gonna require that internally we are resilient to that change, that we are open and receptive to that change. And because that's what's going to lead to the best outcomes. And so we were very proactive in building in that resiliency and letting folks know that we are, it's okay that you're going to be uncomfortable through this change process. Change is by its definition an uncomfortable proposition. But you need to understand that, it's okay to be uncomfortable, and we have to become comfortable being uncomfortable, if that makes sense. We have to be comfortable having tough conversations, and we have to be comfortable looking at things the way we did them in the past, and looking at them in a very critical way and saying, hey, is this, should we be doing this the way we're doing it? Or is there a different path that we need to be going down? So those are some of the things as a leader during that time that it was critical that we do. It was critical that we communicated that with the communities that we serve. I'll tell you, in terms of the protests and everything after that, it was a very stressful time for our officers. We sent officers in to support our Oakland brothers and sisters in those protests. And, our officers go out to these things, they have families at home, they have wives, they have husbands, they have children that know what they're going into and are very stressed about that. So one of the things we wanted to do, and I know you have some questions further on about this, was, how are we going to support our officers and their families to make sure they're in the right mental space when they're going out in these spaces, just day to day in their jobs, much less on a line at a protest. So those are just some of the things that was going through my mind as a leader through that time period. But definitely appreciate that question, because it was definitely, again, something that we will never forget, nor should we.
Right. Thank you, Chief Bowers, for that. As you were saying, as you were responding, a couple of things really stood out to me. You said timely, direct, and communicative. And I thought that was really impactful, especially that timeliness thing, because there was a space and a void and a need for a response. And so it is great to know that leadership stepped up in that moment and actually provided that response that the community was actually looking for. Thank you for sharing that. Chief Armstrong, I'm going to pose the same question to you. And this is in response to the summer of 2020, the police officer involved shootings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. What was the impact to your work, and in particular to your officers as well? Oh, he needs to be unmuted.
Right. I did ask for the permission as well, but he does look frozen, so there might be some technical issues still going on still.
Okay. All right. We'll let him brew on that question, and we'll be sure to definitely double back to get a response once the technology lightens and opens up. Chief Armstrong, are you there? Now we just need to unmute.
Do you see the unmute? There you go. Oh.
Can you hear me now?
There
we
you
can
go.
hear you now.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're having some really bad technology issues, so excuse me. I did hear a lot of the responses. When I think about last year's events, I think about the call for change, right? I think it was a reckoning for law enforcement to recognize that across the country, I think people were alarmed at what they seen. The actions of a police officer that was not consistent with the values of policing, that was not consistent with law, and something I think shocked the conscience of all of us. But it was a true call for reform and how we could, as police, law enforcement in America, move forward in a more collaborative fashion. So I really think in that moment, it was a call for reform. It was a call for much more civilian oversight and inclusion. And I think it really was for law enforcement an opportunity for us to see why people have lost trust in this profession in some ways. And I think, but it also was a galvanizing moment for all of us to say that this is time for us to actually reinvest in building trust in our community, rededicate ourselves to building relationships, and really trying to be much more transparent what we do and why we do it. And so I think for me, it was the moment in leadership where it was time to come out of the conference rooms and get into rooms with community members to talk about how we could be better. How could we take this moment where we seen a tragedy occur in front of us and actually use that as a moment to say, we as law enforcement can be better, we will be better, and we will improve as a result of what community seen. And then, more of a call for those in the community to be more involved and more engaged. And so I think, while tragic, I think it really was something that I hope we all learn from, that does not represent who we are as law enforcement. That is not consistent with what we would expect from a police officer. So as a police leader, it really says to people the importance of us doing things the right way, making sure that we hire the right people, making sure that we have processes to examine who we are providing this level of responsibility and accountability to. And so, I really think for us in Oakland, who is a city built on social justice, that we know that in Oakland, if something happens, people are going to stand up. But it has led to what I think calls for alternative responses to certain things. And I think it's appropriate to think about, has law enforcement been asked for many years to do things beyond their expertise? There are some things that we're trained to do really well, but there are other things that might not be within our wheelhouse. Now, we can do it because we're asked to do it. Are we as effective as the professionals that do it for a living? Probably not. And so the call of question is specifically when we're talking about those that suffer from mental health, those that potentially suffer from some type of abuse, whether narcotics or alcohol, is law enforcement the appropriate response? I think we can begin to accept the fact that we're open to the idea of other professionals responding with law enforcement, responding even without law enforcement, and addressing issues that may not be criminal in nature. And so I think it has definitely caused law enforcement to look at what are we doing, and should we do all the things that we're being asked to do. But it also called the question of community and city leaders to understand that that there might be a need for alternative responses to police. And maybe there is a time to stand up programs like we're doing in Oakland, like our macro program, that will respond to calls that are non-law enforcement related calls. So I just think it is causing us to rethink about our role in community. I think it's clear we need to address violence, we need to address crime, we need to address things that have a direct impact on people's lives. But I think also there's a call to have alternative responses stood up as well.
Thank you, Chief Armstrong. It's interesting to hear that one point, that one time and moment, how it had these really long, strong, lasting impacts to change. And it is good to hear again that there's a response that is happening, and that it's felt genuinely throughout the department, and actually used as like this pivot, right? This moment almost of reclamation to redeem the services and actually really start to engage even more so with the community served. All right. So I'm curious, we're going to get into a little bit about some of the responses. I know oftentimes, and as I speak to many of my criminology students, they are not all the way informed about police responses. And so as a result, misinterpret oftentimes what is going on. So on that same vein, I'm curious to find out about the protocols that were utilized during protest, and how, even if that wasn't applied necessarily in your department, if you could shed some light on protest response and officer response, and how we could anticipate or should expect our officers to respond to protests. I'm not saying riots, but if you could shed some light on that.
Well, I'll say from the Oakland standpoint, who is probably the city that both of these cities help out the most. And I am truly appreciative of both of my partners here, both Officer Chief Bowers and then Chief Washington. I will say, that for us, the first thing that we do by policy is we are mandated to facilitate any protests in the city of Oakland. But how we facilitate that, I think, is different depending on what type of event it is. If it's a protest in which we have direct communication with the organizer, it makes it much simpler for us, because essentially, if they let us know exactly what route they'll be taking, what their intent is, where they intend to go, what is the duration, the number of people that they expect, and we can have some idea of where it is that we need to be, or how we should deploy our officers, or how we should manage traffic or crowd control. It's really helpful, and it allows us to shrink our visible footprint, because we know we have that direct contact, and we know that if there is no violence, there is no vandalism, there is no disruption to traffic in a way that we can't control, then we can allow people to peacefully assemble. And I think what happens is that, what starts off as what we call a peaceful assembly turns into a protest, essentially, where people are not sort of cooperating with law enforcement, that they are beginning to do things that are unlawful in terms of taking over traffic lanes, getting out in the middle of the street, disrupting traffic. Then it becomes a situation where then we have to start, trying to control that movement, trying to make sure that we can contain it into a certain area, trying to make sure that we have adequate responses in case that particular protest were to become a riot or to become a haven for criminal activity. So we are typically prepared for all protests, depending on the size, to facilitate it. But when it becomes something much more challenging in terms of, like you said, a riot, that's, where oftentimes there's a need for us to call for assistance. And through our mutual aid process, that's when we tend to ask for the help of these two departments. When we make a call to these two departments and the times that they've come, in most cases, it's because we have reached our capacity. We can no longer, either the size of the crowd is too large, or either the crowd has become violent in nature and we can no longer control it with the number of officers that we have. And so unfortunately, then we have to call for additional assistance to be able to manage the violence, the vandalism, and whatever things are associated with these type of crowds. But I will say that the vast majority of the protests and peaceful the gatherings in Oakland tend to be peaceful. I'd probably tell you that about 95% of the gatherings that we have in Oakland don't require truly a police response in terms of us actually having to facilitate it in a way in which we have to have, a number of staff members there to sort of be engaged. I think there is just a small few of them that sometimes lead to the need for a number of police resources, as well as the call for mutual aid, which is not very common. So I really do want the public to know that this is not a frequent event, that what we seen last year is something that we don't encounter on a very frequent basis. But when we do have those type of events that reach a level of riotous behavior, we do have a protocol that's in place where we do call for assistance from other agencies to come in and help us out.
And Dr. Moore, just from my perspective, I think what Chief Armstrong laid out is pretty conventional with respect to how many law enforcement agencies respond to these types of things. But the one thing I will call out in terms of the sort of the regional aspect of it that Chief Armstrong alluded to is that when we do go into different cities, particularly if we go into Oakland, one of the things that Oakland was effective in and Chief Armstrong was effective in is communicating sort of the rules of engagement, if you will, with respect to the use of different tactics to deal with these things. So that regardless if it's Piedmont PD going in to assist, or Fremont PD going in to assist, or some other agency going in to assist, on the front end there's communication, there's coordination with respect to, okay, what's going to be used and when is it going to be used, and that we're all sort of on the same sheet of music, if you will, understanding those dynamics when we send our people into there. And so again, the amount of communication that came out of OPD on the front end when we were dealing with these things was helpful, so that we could be, as a chief, I want to I want to have some assurances that if I'm sending my people into a different jurisdiction, that they're going to be as safe as they possibly can, and that they're going to be taken care of as much as they possibly can in that dynamic situation. Again, most of these things are peaceful, but should it, get to that point where we're sending people, more than likely it's not necessarily peaceful. So to the degree that I can, I need to have that assurance as a police leader that where I'm sending my people, that we understand we're on clear footing with those rules of engagement in terms of interactions we're having in those spaces.
I think if I could add that, I think it also goes back to, in my counterparts have nailed this subject, obviously with Oakland having all the experience that they have with protests, but it goes back to, expressive rights, that's embedded in who we are as a nation. Our nation really has evolved and changed because we have that right to peacefully assemble and protest the government. And so what is refreshing, especially with the leaders that we have represented on this call and throughout the region, is that the training that goes into preparing officers for these type of events, understanding our role to help facilitate these type of events, and understanding and recognizing that we are there to support these events, even though the crowd might be there to protest the very folks that are trying to ensure their safety, which is a natural conflict, right? However, like Chief Armstrong talked about, if things are peaceful, there really is no issue there. What we see on the news are only those incidents that are not peaceful. And there's a small minority within any protest that cause the most harm. So to label a protest, a certain group of people that, they're just bent on violence, that hasn't been my experience, and I'm sure my counterparts will express that as well. There are a few individuals in a crowd of thousands that are there just to be destructive and be violent. And so instead of treating or labeling the entire crowd with that response, we try to isolate those individuals and remove them so that the protest can go on in a very peaceful manner. So I just want to add that because I've been impressed over the years of how prepared our respective agencies are, understanding our role in these events. And I hope to get more of that in the future.
So kind of going off of that same question, under what circumstances then, when, I understand about the peaceful protest, but under what circumstances would officers utilize gas or rubber bullets, some of the things that we saw deployed during the protest of summer 2020?
So I'll first start by saying the Oakland Police Department, we are equipped with tear gas. We are not equipped with rubber bullets. And we, even in the protests that happened from last year, we did not deploy any rubber bullets, if you would. So, the circumstances that may lead to the use of tear gas is, when an officer or even a protester is in imminent danger of potential injury. That injury could be through the throwing of rocks or bottles, or in some cases, we've seen Molotov cocktails, things that could injure or cause significant harm to the officer. But also if there was a situation where a protester was being assaulted and we couldn't get there, there's a significant distance, but if we don't deploy, it could potentially lead to potential risk to that person's safety. We have some very strict guidelines when it comes to the deployment of tear gas. It's important to understand that, I've been in this department for a very long time, and 20-something years ago, we would have approached a violent protest much different than we do today. I think what's important is that we don't put both community or law enforcement in harm's way. We want to use techniques that allow us to safely be able to manage a violent protest. And sometimes the deployment of tear gas is the way in which we accomplish that. Simply, traditionally 20 years ago, we would send a group of officers armed with batons in to go in and try to break up a riotous behavior. And that would have led to significant uses of force and potentially significant injuries to potentially the officers and community members. And so as we sort of transition into using things that might present less effect on an individual, less effect on an officer, less harmful to an officer or a community member, I think that's the manner in which we seek to use it in. Now, I will say and acknowledge that during last year's protest, we had 4 days of pretty violent protests, and we assessed every day of that protest, all 4 days. We recognized that 3 of the 4 days we performed, I thought, really well. Our mutual aid partners assisted us and was very effective at managing very violent crowds that had led to obviously multiple injuries to officers as well as firefighters and significant damage to our city. We also, during that night, had a federal officer that was killed at our federal building. So it was a very challenging night for us on the first night. Second night, we encountered a lot of looting and things like that of businesses, pharmacies, things like that. And then on night 4, which was a youth-led protest, was a night that I think, unfortunately, we didn't handle it the best we could have. I thought, there were some lessons learned by our department as well as our officers about the deployment of tear gas. And we, did a very thorough investigation and determined that some deployments was outside of policy. I think, it is important to understand that when we do use these type of techniques, when we use these type of uses of force, the deployment of chemical agents, we, assess these things very closely. That we look at the actions of our officers that deployed them and make sure that their deployment was within department policy. And if it's not, then it's important that the department is also willing to hold people accountable, that they have to adhere to policy. While we understand that circumstances have been crazy over a 4-day period, we still want to make sure when we use force, that force is lawful and that it's within department policy. And so I say, that I'm proud of the work that we did over a 4-day period. I believe that we used, chemical munitions when necessary, but I think when it was unnecessary, I think we made the right calls in terms of holding people accountable. Community has high expectations for us, particularly when you use tear gas and agents like that. And so we want to make sure that when we do deploy them, that community is safe, our officers are safe, and that is compliant with department policy. So I just want to offer that as we have that discussion.
Thank you, Chief Armstrong. Something that you said, everything you said stood out, but just listening when you're saying that the tactics that we use today are different than what was used 20 years ago. So there appears to be some learning going on, what's effective, what's safer, and I definitely heard that in what you shared as well. Let me see, does anyone else have anything to add to that? Pretty succinct response.
Can I just add to Jeremy's point, though, is that one of the lessons we've learned over many protest events is exactly what Chief Bowers talked about, is our need to make sure that when we bring in mutual aid agencies, that we are equipping those agencies with all the proper information, all of the tools that they might need to complete the task that we're asking them to complete. I think it's important that we do everything we can to try to ensure that as much as we can, OPD takes positions on the front line. So I think there's lessons learned over many protests that I've been involved in over many years, that this department has continued to improve. I think every time we have these events, I think Chief Washington can tell you, because he's been in many of our debriefs, that we actually have a debrief. We have discussions about the way in which we handle these events and how we could do better. I think it's always our goal to do better and to learn from each event. And so just recognizing that, a lot of the things that we're doing now is based on lessons learned, to be quite honest. And so I just wanted to offer that.
Okay. Well, I have a question for you all, another question, and this is something that also really arose during this summer of 2020, and this was the call for to defund the police. And I know, Chief Armstrong, I've had the pleasure of having conversations with you about this, but I do ask that you all respond to that cry, and really thinking about, are you aligned with that belief? Are you aligned with that? And if so, how would that be actualized? And if you're not, can you speak to that as well?
Well, I can start off on this one. So defunding the police, I guess for me, especially as a chief, I need you to define a little bit more what that actually means, because there's two things that I hear there from different folks who talk about this subject. There's defund the police, meaning taking resources away from the police department that, in my estimation, will make us less safe as a community. And then there are calls to defund where you divert funds and resources away from things that we have traditionally been asked to do, like Chief Armstrong talked about with, responding to those suffering from mental illness and those type of things. I'm very supportive of that. If today we had the mechanism and the structure in place to send mental health professionals to all of these calls involving folks that are suffering from mental illness, we can do that today. We just don't have that in place now. So we're the available resource. And like Chief Armstrong said, maybe not the most appropriate resource. But when it comes to defunding and taking resources away that I know will be harmful to the community, yeah, I don't agree with that. I will never agree with anything that I feel is going to be hurtful and harmful to our community. I think we need more training, and that requires more funding, not less training. We want our police officers to be more competent in their abilities. We want them to go and engage with the community more. We want to bring in trainers and cultural diversity and awareness and all those other sorts of things. And then we want to invest in technology to where it will reduce the likelihood that we have to use force because we have technology in place that might do that. And then we want to incentivize, our officers to go out and seek higher education and improve themselves and all those other sorts of things. So, and it takes funds to do that. It takes money to do all of those things. So I guess in my mind, we talk about two separate things. If we're talking about taking away resources that ultimately will harm the community, I can't support that. But if we're talking about diverting funds over to other agencies to take away some of the duties that traditionally have been piled on the officers to respond to, yes, I'm truly supportive of any initiative that might bring that forward.
Right.
And Dr. Moore, I appreciate Chief Washington's comment he made about, defining and I think we just need to, as a society and as communities, when we're discussing these things, try not to, we got to try to be a little bit more nuanced and specific and precise in what we're talking about. And just flat out, I am not supportive of the defund the police movement from the standpoint of resources being taken away from what we're supposed to do, which is help keep our communities safe. I think in some respects with some organizations, they've been defunded for quite a while. Whether it's from the 2008 recession, departments were downsized substantially, and many departments haven't even come back from that. So we have been doing more. I concur completely with my colleagues on the panel in terms of what we need to be doing, in my opinion, in my estimation, what we have experienced in my career is we need to be building the capacity of some of these other institutions, mental health, substance abuse, some of these other, job training. We need to be building the capacity in those institutions. But I do not believe that needs to come with the sacrifice and taking away necessarily from law enforcement. I think that, and quite frankly, I think that argument with many electeds throughout the country has already started to wane. I think people are being more precise with what they're talking about. But the funding needs to be built up and needs to be much more robust in some of these other areas that we're talking about, not necessarily taken away from law enforcement.
Yeah, and could I just add that, why does it have to be a choice? Why can't we build those institutions that Chief Bowers were referencing and provide adequate resources to our policing organizations as well? I mean, we tend to find money for so many other things, right? How come we can't do both at the same time? It doesn't have to be an either or, right? We can do both. We can support our local police departments with adequate funding to keep our communities safe and figure out a way how to pay for and build these institutions to take away some of those duties that have been traditionally placed on law enforcement. So I just add that perspective as well, that, you know, I don't think it has to be a choice, one or the other. You know, you only have a certain amount of money and you either put it here or you put it there. I think we can figure out a way to do both.
You know, I'll simply say, you know, I think when we talk about defunding, we need to, you know, start with what are we asking, right? The question is, for me, is are we talking about less police, or are we talking about accountability, right? I think when people, you know, start off with that defunding, I think it was initially thought to be around police accountability, right? The idea that you would see something like the George Floyd murder and believe that you need less police, I think is proven throughout the country to not be an effective strategy. I think, you know, as a city, obviously, that's been defunded, or a police department that has been defunded, I can tell you that we have seen a significant increase in crime. To sit here today and have 115 homicides, which is a 39% increase compared to last year. And it is one of the highest increases in crime in America right now. It says that, you know, we are under-resourced. And I think there's a conversation to be had about wanting to fund those alternative responses that you talked about. And then what is the necessary law enforcement department that you must maintain in order to just provide a safe community. I think what we found ourselves in Oakland right now is that an emotional response to what we've seen in Minneapolis has caused us to shrink this department, but not manage the calls for service and the need for public safety in our city. And so now with a smaller department, we are suffering. We are unable to answer the calls of our community. We are unable to respond to crime in a sufficient amount of time. We're unable to investigate crime at the rate we like to, and we're also unable to prevent crime like we'd like to. And so I think there's a more nuanced discussion, like Chief Bauer said, about what does your city specifically need, because some departments have already been defunded and already have small footprints. So for Oakland, when you have that discussion, you have to put things in context, that Oakland is a department that now sits at 683 officers and are authorized 737, but that still makes it the smallest police department in the country for a city this size, of nearly 440,000 with this level of violence. And so in some ways, the numbers don't add up. It puts us all in a very difficult position where we just don't have the size. The department is just not large enough to be able to manage the number of problems that it's being asked to respond to. And that's where the challenge is that if you're going to defund, the question is if you take resources away, are the reallocation of those resources going to lead to a safer community? I think that's the question, that anytime you divert funding, the goal has to be centered in public safety, that the community has to benefit from the reallocation in a way that makes its city safer than it was prior to. I think if you told me that we were going to fund programs that were proven to actually produce better public safety outcomes, I think I would be better able to be more supportive of things. But right now, what I see is that these diverting of funding has led to a lack of resources to support the needs of our community. And so that's where I think the challenge is. It's a much more nuanced discussion than I think just defunding versus not defunding. I think there's real data behind the consequences of defunding, the consequences of reducing resources, and the impact that it has on community in terms of their ability to get an emergency response when they need it.
Thank you. Thank you all for your insightful perspective on defunding the police and really just the explanation of what that term means, because I do agree it was rather vague. And it did seem to come from more of an emotional place than actually like a practical space. So speaking about the changes that have happened during this time, as you know, we had the summer 2020 with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We also and still have a pandemic that we are living in and through at this time. So can you speak to any changes or increases in crimes that have happened during this pandemic period, and how is your department responding to these changes in crimes?
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. So anytime I talk about what the city of Piedmont is going through, it's always inextricably linked with Oakland. And for those in the audience who aren't aware, I would be shocked about this, but Piedmont, just from a geographic standpoint, is a city that exists within Oakland. In the area of Trestle Glen, Rockridge, Montclair, kind of in between the hills up there, that's where Piedmont's located. So, COVID, first and foremost, the response that we experienced, number one, was in the initial stages and days of COVID when it happened. It was concern about our own officers and staff safety, because in organizations, big and small, I think as leaders, we were all concerned about our own staff and our capability of being able to provide services to the community with the health of our people, being able to show up to work practically, and be able to respond. So on the outset, we put in protocols and procedures to really define what it was we were asking our officers to go out and do, and really some of the things that weren't critical aspects of their response, we basically pulled back on that, because we didn't want to have unnecessary contact with the public that could unnecessarily lead to their exposure and ultimately infection of COVID to happen, unless it had to happen in terms of a contact that we had to have with the public and the services we provided. But as time went on, and different things started happening with respect to COVID, in terms of the amount of crime. Initially, from our perspective, there was a little bit of a dip, but then that activity started picking back up, and it required us, in particularly with gun crimes and the amount of guns we were seeing, even in Piedmont and some of the stops that we had, there was just a lot of guns out there. So that was absolutely of a concern for us in terms of the safety, the challenges it presented and posed to the public and our officers as well. As we're looking now, and obviously there was other challenges that we faced in terms of regionally with respect to COVID and its impact on our jails and whatnot, because folks obviously out of medical concern, our local jails made policy decisions with respect to who they're going to keep and who they weren't going to keep, and who are they going to let out. And I certainly respect those decisions that were made from a health perspective. But at the same time, the thing that we were challenged with, and we still to extent are challenged with, is folks who may have been taken into custody, folks who aren't going to learn from their mistakes, but are going to continue to engage in criminal activity when they're out. Those are things that we as chiefs have to deal with and try to protect our communities with. And that has continued to be a source of challenge. And regionally, we talk about these things, throughout the county and our colleagues. And, we continue to discuss these things and look at these things. And obviously the most violent offenders, are kept in. But at the same time, something that people need to understand is that, individuals, who are engaged in criminal activity, they're not necessarily siloed in what they're engaged in. So what I mean by that is, somebody who's engaged in violent armed robberies, they don't just do that necessarily. Sometimes they're also engaged in petty thefts and other types of crimes. And so it's been a challenge. It's been certainly a challenge, and it will continue to be a challenge, quite frankly. But I think the key for us is, in particularly smaller organizations, is striking that balance between the safety and health of your staff with the challenges that we're experiencing because of the pandemic.
Thank you, Chief Bowers.
I'll just add for us related to COVID. I mean, Chief Bowers pretty much summarized the same sort of challenges that we faced here in Fremont as well. But one of the things that really has been striking was the sharp increase in certain types of crimes that historically we have not experienced here in Fremont. Our shootings have tripled And for us, we usually average about 19 or 20 shootings a year, and we are already at close to 40, and that's concerning. The level of violence that we're experiencing out there has increased significantly. And it's not just Fremont, but we're experiencing that as a profession. And it's really, really concerning. Gun violence is in and of itself its own separate emergency, paralleling the COVID-19 pandemic as we try to deal with all of these emergencies all at once. So, there's a lot of theories on why we're experiencing such an increase in gun violence, but it's something that our communities need to know about and be concerned about as well, because we have to try to mitigate these crimes. They're impacting our communities at such a significant rate that it's at times it's difficult to keep up. And so, I just bring that forward because, things like auto theft and residential burglaries and commercial burglaries, those are concerns as well. We have to try to mitigate those things, but we're shifting resources to try to respond to just the level of violence that we're experiencing in our community. So, property crimes sometimes have to take a back seat to crimes of violence. And that's why it's so critically important that we work with our community to try to figure out what the cause of this spike is and address it as we move forward, because it's just unsustainable. Something's got to give. And I'm really concerned about the level of violence that we've been seeing in our communities.
So I'll just add on, I think both Chief Washington and Chief Bowers both hit most of the issues that I think, are sort of universal to all of our law enforcement departments. But I will say in Oakland, one of the tremendous challenges that we faced during COVID is just, it had a true impact on how we actually address violent crime. We practice a ceasefire strategy in our city. It is heavily focused on direct communication and the ability to call people in and have discussions. But when you have the restrictions around our ability to come into rooms and talk to people, you can't have those meetings, right? We also utilize what we call custom notifications, customized notifications to individuals involved in violence. You can't do that as well. And we couldn't utilize our Department of Violence Prevention in the same manner that we had. Our street outreach teams can't go out and provide that outreach in the community. Our violence interrupters can't go out and deal with these conflicts and try to mediate these feuds between groups and gangs. And so I think that has a tremendous impact on our ability to address violent crime. I will also say, we've been, struck by the level of other crimes that have increased, like Chief Washington talked about. When we talk about the number of homicides related to road rage, when we see the type of conflicts in communities that have led to gun violence that would typically have been resolved with, maybe people just driving away or letting things go, they've escalated to shootings, right? And then, simultaneous as we dealing with the pandemic, we're also dealing with the influx of the ghost gun, right? Which is something that we hadn't been managing 2 years ago, not to the level we are now. So influx of firearms in our community, more people armed with firearms in this sort of compressed environment of having people stay home. I think, we've seen increases in domestic violence. We've seen increase in sexual assaults. So I think it's really touched us in multiple ways. We know that the pandemic is just really reaching places that we hadn't expected. And I don't think that any law enforcement agency or really government at all was really prepared for what a pandemic would look like. And I think, we had no idea at the time of would it change law enforcement's strategies on, actual crime enforcement, how you address violent crime, how you address crime across our city. And we recognize that it had. We also seen a tremendous decrease in our proactive police. And I think Chief Bowers talked about that, just really being selective about who we stop and why we choose to stop them, and making sure our stops were aligned with violent crime as opposed to sort of the low level crime. And so I do think that had an impact as well. We also seen a tremendous increase in violence in our homeless encampments. And that was one new issue that we hadn't really faced, right? Is that, violence and guns in the homeless encampments has led to multiple homicides. It represented 20% of our overall homicides in 2020. So these are sort of new challenges that came out as a result of the pandemic that has forced us to adjust.
you all really painted a great picture of how all of these issues are interconnected. And even though we may not necessarily connect them, this pandemic and actually you're speaking into the connectedness of these issues really is highlighted. And I definitely appreciate that. I knew about violence rising because we could see that on the news, but all of the other issues, the violence in the homeless encampments, the way in which officers are engaging and selectively choosing to engage. All of those things are maybe not as, that information is not as readily available. So thank you for speaking into that and sharing that information with people. Even thinking about or speaking about the domestic violence that has increased over this time period. And even the angst of people being in the house and then coming out, and how that transition has also contributed in some ways to the escalation in crime and violence overall. Yeah. Seem like y'all pretty busy over there. All right. Next question to you all, and this is really about more of your approach, the agency approach here. How is your agency, your department, working to create transparency and build trust within communities? So we hear some of the challenges, we heard a lot of the challenges, and even about some of the services that are not available because of COVID restrictions. But despite that, or because of that, how is your department responding in its transparency here?
Yeah, I think we've done a couple things in Oakland. I mean, one of the things you might have seen is that, I did a rally for Safe Oakland in July, which brought out about 400 people rallying against violence in the city of Oakland. I really think that was an effort to bring community together to take a stance against this high level of violence that we've seen. We've also done a new series called Conversations Towards Solutions. And essentially, the city of Oakland is divided into 35 beats. And what we've committed to doing is going to every single beat and having a community meeting with that particular community group and talking to them about how not only I always say it's easy for people to complain, much more challenging for people to help, solve problems, right? And so our officers every day come in with a focus on solving problems, right? Trying to fix things. And so really, this was an effort to sort of bring community into that conversation, to talk about how we not just complain, but how we talk about fixing things. And so we've been going throughout our city. We are up to 21 community meetings with hearing from the average of about 20 to 25 community members and discussing how we can work together. I think it's not my goal to say that this police department needs to be, at the staffing levels that some, researchers have said, 1,100, 1,200 officers. Instead, let's figure out how we can really deal with the problems of today, but deal with them in a way that is collaborative. And so I thought that's been really effective. We've also been doing several events in the community engagement events to just reintegrate ourselves into the community. I think the pandemic has definitely put a distance in between people overall. We've been less likely to stand next to people, talking to people with masks on. And so sort of reintegrating ourselves and getting back used to having dialogue with people, I think is key, but also coming right off of, issues around George Floyd and calls for change in law enforcement. I think it's important that law enforcement now overly invest in reestablishing relationships with community. And that's what our effort has been towards.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Chief Armstrong. You have to be multifaceted in your outreach to community. It's got to be in person. It's got to be that personal thing and getting out and where people are and where they're at, meeting people where they're at. It's got to be in the digital space as well. Social media is obviously been effective that many departments across the country have utilized. And it's got to be in your data, in the things that you're providing and putting out to your public as well. In Piedmont, we do a lot of community events, a lot of community engagement. We've done the things, National Night Out. We've done those types of things. But one of the things that we have in Piedmont, we have a pretty robust surveillance footprint. I'll just say it as what it is. We have a number of fixed license plate readers around the city at strategic points, in addition to standing up a public safety camera or surveillance camera program as well. And it's been extremely effective in not only investigating crimes, but proximately affecting crimes, in identifying folks engaged in criminal activity and responding immediately to either take them into custody or minimally, they see us coming and they leave town. So one of the things that we did in terms of transparency, and let's be frank, a lot of people feel very differently, have different perspectives about surveillance technology. And rightfully so. I think we need to be accountable to the surveillance technology that we're utilizing and be open and honest with it, with the public. In Piedmont, with the company that we're working with, we were the first in the country to set up a transparency portal with respect to our data. And so we put that online through our website in terms of aggregate information on the data that we're collecting. We're very transparent with the number of devices that we have, where they're at, and the information they're collecting. Again, it's aggregate information because we want to protect people's privacy. But you have to be transparent with that, and you have to continue to be accountable to the public. It's an awesome responsibility that I feel that we're able to utilize that technology. And I would hate for something to happen where it would diminish our ability to utilize it, because it is so effective, not only for us, but regionally. That information is critical to our regional partners as well. So, the other thing too is I think organizations, we all have our policies and procedures that are out there in the public purview. That's something that law enforcement has been doing for a bit of time now. And one of the things that we've done in our organization is ensuring that people understand how our organization is running. And so we put our strategic plan online, so that anybody can, go in if they have the time and energy and interest, can see exactly what we're doing and how we're doing it. So I think the days of, sort of that closed sort of perspective, if folks are involved in that, that's gone by the wayside. And more than ever, I think, folks are putting information out in the public purview, which is healthy.
Yeah, and I would just offer, both my colleagues summed it up quite nicely, but the common theme here is that COVID had widespread impacts beyond just the medical piece, right? Or the health component.
Right.
It is critical that we engage with our communities, but for the past 18 months to a year, we had to slow that down or stop that completely altogether. So that has impacted us. It has set us back. COVID has set us back from engaging and being able to communicate effectively with our community. A Zoom call is not as good as being there and looking someone in their eye and expressing your feelings. A Zoom call, you can't hug a Zoom call. You can't comfort someone over a computer screen, all those other sorts of things. So I think, the common theme here is that as we start to get out of the impacts of COVID, we have to double down on our efforts to get back out there in the community. And some of the things that, Chief Armstrong and Chief Bowers are talking about are exactly the things that we're doing here in Fremont as well, trying to schedule some of these meetings, listening to our communities and being very responsive. So that builds trust, that builds legitimacy, transparency, like has already been talked about, is critical. Transparency, in my opinion, is a friend of law enforcement. The more we can explain and show and demonstrate to our community what we do and what we're about, the better for everybody. Everybody's going to understand and trust their local police department. So again, I think COVID has a lot of impacts, and definitely the community engagement piece, caused some disruption for, I think, all of law enforcement over the last year or so.
And so as we transition out of this pandemic, how do you see your services transitioning as well, or the services provided transitioning? Because this is now a new normal that we will be existing in. And so you kind of spoke to it, you all kind of spoke to it, but are there any things that you see that will be implemented that are totally new as a result of not just the pandemic, but have been ushered in because of so much of these incidents or these events that have been happening?
Well, I'll just speak real briefly on, I think we've stayed pretty steady on our commitment to provide service to the community. But again, like I just spoke about, I know that there's been a gap over the last 18 months about as it relates to our ability to get out in the community and engage. So one of the adjustments that we're making here in Fremont, and it's not my idea, I stole it from another respective agency. And by the way, no police department owns a good idea. I will steal good ideas all the time, and I've done it. And I've stolen from these two on this panel quite often. But we're gonna challenge our officers to get out of their cars and engage with the community more. Exchange phone numbers, try to problem solve, develop their own passion. Each officer has a passion. We got into this profession for a reason. So if you enjoy writing traffic citations and mitigating the impact of traffic accidents, then do that, but get in that community and explain what you're doing and why. If there's an issue, if you enjoy presenting on safety and those type of things, well, get out into the schools and do those type of things and explain why you're there and what you are trying to accomplish for your community. So I've challenged my staff recently to do just that, to try to re-engage with the community and provide that service, but also explaining the why you're doing what you're doing in a sense of transparency as well. So anyway, that's one adjustment that we've made recently that I look forward to seeing how that plays out.
Yeah, I think Chief Washington covered most of it, but I will say that one of the things that I actually, have begun to do a little bit differently is actually, I created on our website a Compliment a Cop app, right? I mean, a Compliment a Cop section, because I do believe that one of the things that we haven't done, I think, is, a good enough job is recognizing and highlighting the positive and good work that our officers are doing. I think community doesn't know the things that officers are doing every day to make the city safe or make the cities in their respective communities safe. And I think we could do a better job, because I think when something bad happens, everybody knows about it. It spreads across the country. But there are heroic actions being taken by officers in uniform every single day. Every single day, they're meeting the challenge of going to emergencies and doing their best to make sure that they provide a quality service to our community. And I think it's important that community in this moment recognize that law enforcement is not as attractive as it was 2 to 3 years ago. That some of these events has actually, made people feel like this is not a career that they desire to be a part of. That this career is very challenging because the amount of scrutiny that you're under, the amount of criticism that you face. And so to encourage people to continue to be of service to their communities and come take on this enormous responsibility, I think we need to highlight the things that we want to see in police officers. When we see behavior that's consistent with our values, that is that really is consistent with the values of our community, that is the best of what we have to offer as law enforcement, I think we have to honor that, because we want our officers to perform at a high level. And for those that don't perform at that level, which represents a very small percentage, I think we can clearly send a message that maybe this is not the right profession for them. And I think it's important, because this is a tough job, man, in a city like Oakland or any city where you have to take on this enormous responsibility. It's a tough job. And so I hope that community appreciates the job that they do. I hope they understand the sacrifice that it came along with. These officers didn't get to telecommute, right? While everybody else was sitting in their living rooms on, watching Zoom, they actually had to be physically on the ground, putting their safety at risk every single day, exposing themselves to COVID and other things. And so I think while we sometimes can be critical, I think sometimes we have to take a minute to honor and recognize the sacrifice that these officers have made during this enormous time.
Yeah, I think that's well said by Chief Armstrong. And I think he's speaking to one of the things that, as stewards of this profession, is on our minds, and that's how we're gonna leave this profession when our time is done, and who's going to be here to carry the mantle when we're done. We need to have outstanding people in these law enforcement roles. And so I couldn't agree with Chief Armstrong any more than that. I just think that I talked earlier about resilience, and I think that's one thing that's going to remain from the pandemic to the the social things that we're talking about, the social equity things and the police reform topics that we're talking about is an understanding in our profession that change is going to be a constant. And so it's incumbent upon us as leaders and as the communities that support our departments that we do all we can to make sure that our folks are resilient to that change, whether it be from our own change that we are seeking ourselves or changes that are imposed on us. It's critical that from a wellness standpoint that we help our folks navigate that evolving that evolution that is going to continue to come.
Thank you. As you all speak about the future, this the future of the departments and the changes that are occurring, when you're thinking about the future law enforcement officers, what qualities or skills? I know Chief Bowers, you mentioned resiliency, but what else are you looking for when you think about the next officer, when you're looking at hiring for these positions?
So I'm going to jump in just because I had a vision that ran through my head, and I've told the story before. So, but before I came up here to the East Bay, I was in San Jose, and I was the training commander for San Jose PD. And under my command at that time, we had a video unit that was responsible for putting together, PR and all that kind of good stuff. And so, the video unit that I commanded at that time put on a production where it was a recruitment video. And the recruitment video had, your conventional, had a SWAT team that was kicking in a door and, rappelling down out of a helicopter. We don't even really do that in law enforcement, but I'm joking. They weren't really rappelling out of a helicopter, but it was a SWAT team kicking in a door, making an arrest on somebody who was involved in some illicit activity. And so when I think about how we're recruiting now, that's the smallest piece of what police work is about, being on that SWAT team and kicking in a door. It's about, the type of people I want to bring on now are critical thinkers. The people I want to bring on now have a stake in the game, have skin in the game in terms of the community that they want to come and serve. The person I want to hire now, is somebody who understands what it is that we're looking for in the city of Piedmont, what our community values in terms of what the interactions that they see in their community, what kind of safe community they want, the type of that they understand, they understand that they're truly, when we get in this profession, people talk about, you go through an oral panel and you get asked the question about why do you want to get in law enforcement? And a lot of people answer that question because I want to help people. I want to serve people. That really needs to be embodied. That's what I really want to see is that they not only are saying that, but they've demonstrated that as well in their life to that date. And you want to see, one of the things about Piedmont that's interesting is we don't reflect the community that we serve. We're much more diverse than the community that we serve. And so diversity of actual lived experiences and background is critical in my estimation. But also diversity of thought is going to be critical as well. Communication skills are at a premium. And again, one of the things I tell young people who are getting in this line of work is, and I'll even extend that to my own son who's in college and has expressed an interest. I said, listen, you need to, if you want to get in this field, you need to go into it with eyes wide open because as Chief Armstrong said, it's a tough job. But the thing about it is, the deal I made with my son is, you cannot get a degree in administration of justice or criminal justice. I want you to be nuanced. I know.
Okay,
I know.
I'll let that slide. Continue.
But in all seriousness, it's like, hey, with the type of people I want to bring people on with a broad experience beyond just administration of justice. So criminological theory, okay, is a little bit more nuanced than administration of justice. So I'll accept that. Okay. If he goes into that field of work, but in all seriousness, no, I just think what we're looking for is somebody who's in this day and age much more nimble, much more broad-based, as opposed to perhaps what was looked for in the past. And again, it goes back to what we project that we're looking for. And so that's why I told the story about the video. In our department, you're not going to see, you know, a recruitment video of a SWAT team kicking in a door, because that's not really reflective of what all that we're looking for.
Yeah, I got to say, Chief Bowers pretty much nailed it. I mean, we're all looking for the same folks, and exactly the traits that he just described would be all of the things that I'm looking for as well. The diversity of thought really stood out to me because that's what, you know, we all have. All the folks on this panel, right, come from different places, but we all have that diverse thought and background, and that just brings such a balanced perspective to an organization. You know, I talk about to my staff cultural awareness and cultural diversity, and sometimes, you know, when we bring trainers in, sometimes, you know, my officers will roll their eyes, oh, why do we need this? And it sounds like an accusatory type reaction that we need cultural diversity and those type of things. And I always bring up the story of how I grew up. And I grew up in LA. And when I say 100% of my neighborhood was African-American, 100% was African-American. I knew nothing else. Our beliefs, our culture, the way of life, everything. So had an opportunity to go to college and play basketball, and they paired me with someone who was not African-American, right? And so, but my perspective was so narrow. That's all I knew. That's all I knew was that experience. And so I learned from this individual. I learned their culture, their background, what made them and we're the best of friends even to this day. And so I tell my staff that I myself needed some cultural diversity. I myself needed some cultural awareness, being a Black man growing up in the Los Angeles area. So I definitely look for that, like Chief Bowers stated, diversity of thought. And sometimes you can get that from how you grew up and your experiences as a young person. The more diverse we are as an organization, I think the more successful we're going to be. And I tell my staff that, hey, we're on a train going across country, and we're going to come into different towns along the way, and they're going to have different issues and perspectives. And I want to be able to look behind me and say, does anyone have experience? Can anyone relate to the issues that are going on in this particular town? And I don't want to have everyone who has my perspective. I want to have folks that can help me communicate with a particular group and understand where they're coming from as it relates to their issues. So anyway, I just add that to what Chief Bowers already articulated as to what I think is needed in law enforcement at this particular time.
Well, I think they've essentially hit everything, right? It's hard to come in behind those two, because I think they've described everything. I think, you know, I really, you know, try to see candidates that is community minded, right? I want to have a diverse group. I do believe that in this moment it's so important that we increase the number of women in law enforcement. I think that they bring a unique perspective. I think that they do phenomenal work, and I think they are definitely under recruited in law enforcement. And so we are targeting women candidates for police officers, because we recognize their value to the profession, and think that having a department that is 12 to 15% women is just not enough. I think I heard there's a new mantra called 30 for 30. They want to have 30% women in law enforcement by year 2030. And I think we want to start here. So really trying to have, a diverse group of new candidates that represent the community in which we're asking the police. I do think what Chief Washington said is key, though. While the numbers make a difference, right? A couple of this and a sprinkle of that and a little bit of this, I think what's more critical is diversity in thought, right? To empower those that you bring from diverse communities to actually bring their culture with them, right? Help this department better understand how to deal with our cultural differences, right? Be a leader in terms of helping your colleagues understand how to better interact with those from your culture and your community. I've always felt like, being from Oakland and being an African-American officer, I always felt like I had a unique role to bring my culture, my upbringing into the police department, and let it be informative to others. Let it be something that I can help people understand the way we think, the the way we move in Oakland, right? Just because we talk loud and sometimes we move fast doesn't necessarily mean we're a danger to you. It's just who we are, right? But I think when you take time to sort of help people understand something that they may not be accustomed to, right? That if you didn't grow up in a diverse community and you haven't had, a lot of interactions with people from other racial backgrounds or things like that, you sometimes may not know. But it's important that for those that are from those sort of backgrounds to be able to inform you. And so encouraging my officers to be much more comfortable. So one of the things that we've invested in heavily is what we call equity teams, right? And these equity teams are designed specifically to have conversations around policy and practice development, bringing forth equity teams to have discussion. What is the impact that this would have on particular cultures? How would it affect your, a certain group of people? Recognizing the role that LGBTQ play in our community now, right? And that I had a chance to take my entire command staff to the LGBTQ community center, and we learned a lot, right? That we learned that the history of that community and law enforcement and how the lack of trust that exists between those two, and recognize that was important that we offer those type of recruiting opportunities to that community as well. So I think it is a learning opportunity for all of us about recruiting from a diverse group of people.
Wow, that is really good to hear. Really good to hear different populations, different communities being targeted, and the changes that are evolving as a result of that. Just wanted to kind of speak inquire a little bit more about the supports that officers receive. So going through the academy, how are officers prepared mentally, right? We know that there's now been a greater space for mental health and mental health awareness. What types of supports are available? And if they are provided during the academy, is that, something new that is happening? Or at what point in an officer's career are they privy to these resources?
Well, we first at the Oakland Police Department introduced our wellness program to our trainees in the academy. We know our academy can be very tough. The academy can be stressful. We are, asking people to change their lives in the way in which they do things. And so that could bring stress. It could bring stress on them and their families. So we began to offer them that support in the academy, and that continues within our department. So we have our own department psychologist. We also have an EAP program, an employee assistance program for our officers. And so we're always trying to make sure that we are mindful of their health and wellness. I will say, that this younger generation, there are generational differences in officers. When I came in many years ago, you would have officers not actually seek services, right? And wouldn't want to speak up about, stress that they were feeling, anxiety that may have been affecting them. But I think now this newer generation, and because we're doing it in the academy, is definitely opening people up to their willingness to actually ask for help. And so we, are encouraging our officers to take advantage of these resources. And one of the things that I think is really unique about what we're doing now is that we're actually doing what we call critical incident debriefs after every major incident that we have in the city. And that includes every member having a mandatory appearance with our psychologists. And so we're debriefing and having those discussions about how these particular incidents actually affected the officers. So when we have a death of a child, or when we have an officer involved shooting, or if any officer is involved in a significant use of force, making sure that that officer, before being allowed to come back to duty, is clear that that officer has a chance to speak to the psychologist and has a chance to debrief and talk about how they felt. I think we have to get away from this idea that being a police officer means that you must be Teflon and nothing affects you and nothing hurts you or nothing, has an impact on you. We know that's not true. And so we are now trying to create environments that are comfortable for people to share. Because when you have an officer that is in a good mind, a good space mentally and physically, they go out and they're more effective in doing their jobs, right? They're less likely to get into confrontation. They're less likely to have use of force because they are able to use all of the de-escalation techniques that we've been teaching them. And so I think it's so vital, and it's something that I must say that is new to some of us older officers, is how do we make sure that we're always considering officers' health and wellness whenever they are involved in incidents, recognizing that people have issues in their personal life as well that could also affect the way they police. Having that opportunity available for them to utilize those resources are important as well.
Thank you, Chief Armstrong, for that.
I have nothing to add. He nailed it. So that's exactly the perspective that I share as well. So.
All right. Well, thank you. Knock that one out the park. And it is actually great to hear about the resources available to officers. So many resources available, and actually just being mindful of having the conversations around mental health and recognizing mental illness and making the connections between its impact to the work itself. All right. Got a lot of information out of you all today. Thank you. Thank you for informing us. So we're going to transition into Q&A, but before we do, I actually have one final question for each of you. And however you respond, this is really speaking into your legacy that you would like to leave as an officer, as a chief, as a member of the Black community, right? How do you see your legacy in this position, in this leadership position, and what do you want it to be?
Well, I'll take a stab at it and go first. And so, for me, it's a little uncomfortable to talk about, what legacy I would like to leave, because really that's for others to determine, right? So I'm not going out there trying to do things in order to have my legacy kind of solidified. But it really goes back to staying true to who I am, not compromising my integrity for anyone or anything. And I think that naturally builds your legacy, right? We have a responsibility as law enforcement officers. We have a responsibility as Black men. We have a responsibility as humans to try to position this profession and ensure that it remains one of the most noble professions on the planet. And we have that opportunity because our perspectives are different in a lot of ways. And so that's not lost on me at all. The level of responsibility I have, also being in a position that we're in, there are little boys and girls who are looking to us as maybe there's an opportunity to get involved in this profession, to ascend to the top to where you can make a difference, right? Your voice is a little bit louder as you ascend in any organization. So really for me, I think Chief Bowers said is setting up the next generation, continuing the evolution of law enforcement, understanding that change is not only going to happen, we should embrace it, and trying to leave this profession a little bit better than I found it, right? When I first got into law enforcement. So that really rings true to me, my responsibility, sharing my experiences with some of the young officers, coordinating with my partners out there in other agencies, trying to be the best we can as a profession, as an agency. It's an ongoing challenge. I have so much respect for these two chiefs on this panel, but the reason why the Bay Area leads the country in professional law enforcement is because we challenge each other. So like I said, these two know I will steal all their good ideas, and I'm not ashamed to do that. But what it does is it starts to elevate the entire profession when we do that. I made some notes tonight about how some things that I learned tonight from the perspectives of these chiefs, and that just really plays into what I'm talking about as far as ensuring the survival of this very noble profession. So, if I can leave this profession just having that one mark, or doing my part to ensure that we are consistently delivering a professional law enforcement service to our communities, I would say that my career has been a success. So for me, I guess that's how I would respond to that.
Thank you for that, Chief Washington.
So, you know, a lot of what Chief Washington said, I can definitely identify with in terms of my legacy. But I also agree with his sentiment of, you know, that's going to be for others to you know, kind of talk about, you know, my legacy. And I say that because I think maybe all of us on this panel and can maybe identify with this, but you know, people who want to ascend to different levels in the organization, I always have a saying, and it's like, just, hey, if you want to become a sergeant, a lieutenant, a captain, a deputy, I say the higher you go, you just need to understand the less it's about you. You know, and so that's sort of my mantra. You know, the higher you go, the less it's about you, and it's about your people, and it's about the people you're serving, and that's what it's about. And so that for me is my legacy. I think these past couple of years have been extremely challenging, I think, is an understatement, but I also feel an immense amount of just honor that I have been able to serve during this time of such a tumultuous time, particularly in the community that I'm doing it in, you know, a community where, you know, ultimately, you know, my legacy is, I hope, is going to be to have in as healthy of a way, but in as accountable a way as possible, that we've had open dialogue about, you know, you know, common day practices in policing, but also the history we have, the history of policing, the history of the city of Piedmont, in its relation to Oakland and what that represents, and really having some heartfelt, open conversations and dialogue, you know, and that, you know, again, we can do two things at once. We can have pride in an honorable profession that hasn't always been so honorable, and that we can own our history, and we can move forward in a way that that really fulfills the promise that we have as a country and as a profession that we profess. So that in short, it was, you know, is what I want to leave behind in my waning years in this profession.
I think, you know, when you hear that, you often think of, in my waning years too, in this profession, you know, I think about, for me, I think, you know, I hope legacy obviously is something that I hope when people remember me, I hope they see me as a uniter, as someone that stepped into the middle and was willing to bridge the gap, someone that that was courageous enough to say that it doesn't have to be us against them. It can be one community built around safety. And so I hope in this moment, and I think Chief Bauer said it well, in this very important moment, I think, you know, I think history of law enforcement has showed us there's been several different sort of, I think, linchpin moments in law enforcement history where there was an opportunity for true change and reform. And I think we're in that moment now. I hope in that moment that I'm a part of the leadership at the executive level in law enforcement that is moving forth different ideas where everybody in our community has a sense of fairness and equity. So that everybody feels like that they feel safe in the company of law enforcement. And I think when you look at the marred history of law enforcement over hundreds of years, you obviously know that there are some people that obviously have, for good reason, a lack of trust in law enforcement. The question is that we know this is a noble profession designed to serve people and to be there when people are in their greatest need. The question is how do we as law enforcement begin to make everyone feel that way? Some people, some communities feel differently than others. How do we make this fair and equitable for all communities, where all people feel like they're going to be treated with dignity and respect? And so in this moment, it's my, you know, I feel a moment in time to just say that as, you know, as a leader, I have a, you know, responsibility, particularly as the African-American chief, right? A responsibility to say that I recognize the inequities that this profession has brought forth in our community over many years. But I think when you look at this screen tonight, you know that there's an opportunity for equity, that there is an opportunity for diversity, that there's an opportunity for inclusion. And it really does start with us, right? It starts with us setting the tone of what we expect from those that we lead. And hopefully developing future leaders that embody those same values. that understand how important it is that we don't see regression, that as we work so hard to try to build trust and credibility for a profession that we know is critical to the American infrastructure, that is done in a way that people respect and honor. And so I think if we can do that, if we can take it even one step forward, I think we've done a lot. And so, for us, my mother always said, if you take on something, make sure it's better than it was when you got there, right? And so I think when I step away, I just hope this organization is better than it was when I sat down. And so that's the approach every day, is trying to make it better. Better not only for the members of this department, but make it for the community that it serves.
Well, thank you all for that. Thank you for sharing the legacy that you will lead, and even really just speaking about your legacy as you sit in this position right now. Appreciate your openness and really self-reflective ability to communicate and share your experience, and also what is going on within your department as well. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and transition to questions and answers. So I'd like to encourage the audience to ask questions. You'll have a couple of minutes, so be sure to get those in. And I actually do have 2 questions for you in the queue. So let me see here. Okay.
So you see them, right?
I see them, yes.
Okay, great.
All right. So I think one of the first question, and this was around officers' response to incidents. What about officers who are deployed multiple nights in a row? How are they taken care of by the department on a psychological level? Do you see that the empathetic response and ability to respond within departmental expectations changes the longer protests go on? So this question was posed when we were talking about protests, but nonetheless, you have a response to this.
Yeah, I'd say one of the lessons learned in the George Floyd protest was the need to actually rotate officers out on a continuous basis to make sure they're fresh, that they have time to actually re-energize and get there, to separate one day from another. I think is critical. And that's why when we talk about size and resources, the ability to have officers available to take their positions, right, is really, staffing is super critical, because you don't want people out there like we had during this 4-day period for the entire 4 days, 14, 16 hours a day. And so one of the things even that I wrote in our after action report was a lesson learned, was that what we've seen is carryover. That 3 days was violent, and then anticipation of violence in the 4th day led to use of force. So I think this is a critical point, a lesson learned that we, in OPD have employed, separating teams, making smaller teams so that we have more teams available to actually rotate in and out, is something that we will be doing moving forward. And that was a lesson learned during the protest. So I think very important question, recognizing not only the health and wellness, but also the fatigue that comes along with being here for many days in a row, and how that affects your decision-making. I think it's critical.
Yeah, and I think to tag on to that, in addition to the acute moments that Chief Armstrong's talking about, just on a long-term basis, I think a lot of organizations have restrictions on the number of hours officers can work on overtime, restrictions on secondary employment. So you have officers on their primary job, but officers, if they're working security or some other type of capacities, there's limits on that. And really, we hold our sergeants accountable too. The sergeant rank in our organization is critical for identifying, when their subordinates, when the officers that they're working with may be under stress and whatnot. So building up their capacity to monitor those situations and step in when need be. But that's in going back, to what we've talked about as well in terms of the staffing challenge. In a lot of departments, folks are working on mandatory overtime. Days off, are important, so people can go back and recharge, be with their families. But if, you have officers that are coming back on 1 or 2 of their days off on mandatory overtime, that's critical. And we also have to talk about, not only our police officers on the streets, but the folks who are on our dispatch centers. those folks, in certain respects, our dispatchers are, the staffing challenge there is even in some respects tougher than it is on the streets in some capacities. So, those are the people who are public's communicating with and who's getting critical information over officers. So, that's a great question. It's critically important that, that we maintain that. And again, it goes back to the wellness component as well.
Well said by both.
Another question in the Q&A section is, do you come across corrupt officers? And if so, what happens?
Well, I corrupt, so I haven't come across any corrupt officer in my career, but I can just tell you how I would respond. So we have very high standards, and I'm sure those high standards are across all departments, but that's exactly what we're talking about tonight, right? The trust, the ability for us to police ourselves, the ability for us to hold ourselves accountable is what makes a legitimate law enforcement agency. It's what our public expects us to do, right? So, there are specifics as far as discipline, as far as investigations, that we have to abide by when we come across certain type of activities that we feel don't align with either the law or our policies or expectations of the community, and we take action on that. And so anytime there's something that happens at whether it's Oakland PD or Piedmont or LAPD, that impacts the entire profession. So I have an obligation here in Fremont to ensure that I am being responsive and I am following up and holding my folks accountable, because I owe it to my partners out there as well, right? To ensure that we're being true to profession. So, I haven't come up with any situation where there was corruption that I witnessed, and I would be very shocked if that was going on. But we also have built a culture of ensuring that our officers hold each other accountable as well. So the expectation here is don't lose your job trying to protect somebody else's job. They're not going to pay your bills. So you need to come forward and you need to be truthful and report improper behavior if you see that. That's the expectation that we have. So anyway, hopefully that addresses the question, but I don't have a specific example of identifying any corruption, at least in my agency.
Good to know.
I would say that I think the tone of that question is just challenging for me because, corruption is just a series of misconduct, right? Some significant misconduct that would be not tolerable by any department. And so I hope that, just like Oakland, anytime we would meet any misconduct, we would address that misconduct and make sure that we don't allow that type of behavior to continue. I think what's important is that, we all have strong mechanisms of accountability and the willingness to make tough decisions. And I think in this moment, that's what it calls for. Chiefs who have the courage to call, a ball and a strike, right? And to make these tough calls when they find themselves in front of us. And so I think that is the call of the moment, right? The ability for us to say that it's important for us to, when we see things are that violate policy, that is not in line with our values and the values of our community, that we call those things out. And then we be transparent about those things and not try to protect those that have no business wearing a badge. And so I think that's how I view it. And I think, taking on the job, I understood, what it came with, and I'm comfortable with that. And so I think from our organization standpoint, we will hold people accountable. So corruption will not be tolerated in the Oakland Police Department.
Yeah, and just to put a bow on that, I think again, you have to have it's culture, but it's also structural. You have to have the structural things in place to be able to root those things out, and it has to be in your policies. And finally, it just I think we're at the place right now where I think, many in law enforcement, our officers who are on the street, they don't want to see it, because it makes their lives more difficult as well. And so, I'm glad to say in Piedmont, officers corrupt, haven't seen it to that level. But in my prior place, unfortunately there were examples of that. And I felt, you in the officer on the street who's doing the right thing, when that stuff comes out and it's public, you feel the weight of that as an officer. You feel the weight on that badge when, your colleague does something and raises to the level of out and out corruption, and the public sees it. It's a mark on your badge. And to Chief Washington's point, that's something that everybody feels and nobody wants.
All right, thank you for that. One last question here. And I know this was something that I think you all may have referenced before. The question is, what does it mean to be true to the profession? And then also about the implementation of culture training. So what does that look like as you all are speaking about the culture that exists and the policies that support the culture? How do you develop that?
I'll start, and I'll try to be respectful of the time here. I know we're running out of time, and I want to be respectful for everyone's time. But I think I mentioned being true to the profession quite a few times tonight. What it means to me is that I hold this profession in high regard. We police with the consent of the community. Our authority is given to us by the community. And so for me, being true to the profession are things like honesty, integrity, professionalism, dedication. And that's being true to the profession. So my actions, my leadership needs to uphold those values. So anything outside of that is not being true to the profession. So I look at the profession, whether it's in Piedmont or Oakland or Fremont or anything, is that we all share those core values. And so it's my responsibility to ensure that my officers are being true to the profession by sharing those values and carrying out those values to our community. So that's what I mean by being true to the profession. The other part of that is the cultural awareness and cultural diversity. So some of those things are mandated by the police officer standards and training posts. We have to have a certain amount of cultural awareness, cultural diversity, but most agencies go beyond that. And for me here, at least in Fremont, is that we have such a uniquely diverse community that yes, you get the cultural diversity in the police academy, but I want to pull out folks that represent our uniqueness and our diversity within our community and have those folks present to us that awareness. Let me hear from them, those folks who we're serving, right? That may have concerns, that may have perspectives that our staff may not share. So I want it to be more community-based, those perspectives from our community, because ultimately those are the folks that we're providing the service to. So I want to hear from them. I want to hear from our community members and invite them in to have dialogue with our officers, because I just think it's beneficial. The more we know about each other, the better off we are overall. So that's just my perspective.
I agree with Chief Washington, so I'm not going to, out of respect to time, I'm not going to repeat that. Well, I was saying Piedmont, the things that we're looking at right now with respect to equity in some of those things is we're actually right now, in addition to the mandated stuff, we're looking right now, every member of the department, we're having training on anti-racism and equity and specifically the history of Piedmont. And ensuring that all of our staff understands how our city developed, how it was created, in having a real conversation about what the history of our department has been in the city. So it's critically important for me to understand, for my officers to understand, and all my staff to understand historically what has it meant, what is Piedmont meant in the space in which it exists. And how does that history really connect to the present day? And why do certain people feel that when they come into the city, that they may not be welcomed. And where does that come from? And how, and that may not affect a specific decision that officer is making right then and there on a specific day. It may, but it's important. We, as police officers, they hold an awful lot of power. We hold an awful lot of power as police officers, and to not understand the history of the city in which you're policing and the implications of that, particularly of people of color who may be living in your community or just passing through, you have to have that. You have to have that awareness and understanding. So those are some of the things. That's something specifically that we're doing now.
Thank you.
And I won't belabor this issue. I'll just say that, all of the things that both chiefs have been talking about, except, I will add that the OPD is now has partnered with Stanford University to actually create a cultural competency course. And it really is built around some of the things that Chief Powers was talking about, understanding the community in which you police, the history of that community, the history between law enforcement and that community, and sort of what is the foundation of culture. People use that term very loosely, right? The culture of an organization, but what builds culture? Individuals make up organizations. And so when we talk about a culture of an organization, it's built on individual beliefs, right? And so we want to be able to address those beliefs. We want to address the things that those people value and make sure those values are consistent with the culture that you're trying to build, right? And so one of the things that we'll be doing in the training is really bringing that forth to our officers to have a better understanding of what's led to the mistrust in our community over many years, and why, although you may not have been here when things happen, the fact that people still hold you accountable to those actions because of the uniform, right? That sometimes it's not the individual, but it's what the uniform represents for certain people. And so how do we, recognize the call for rebuilding trust? How do we recognize the call for reconciliation, right? How do we recognize the call for being able to come up with solutions together? So I think that's what we'll be training to. We look forward to our officers being engaged in a way that we haven't, because this will be the first time we've actually offered a training where it'll be done in 4 series, but officers will leave each series with a deliverable, something that they need to do in practice and bring back to the next course. What we want to do is not just make it a course where people sit through and they get a training that lasts a very short period of time, and then they need to be recalibrated. This is going to be something that we hope that they take in and instill into their day-to-day interactions every day about how they treat people and how they take our cultural differences seriously. And so I think that's what I think will be unique about this time, but I'm looking forward to it.
Well, thank you all. I'm actually happy to hear about all of the changes and progress that is happening within all of your respective departments. I do want to say, thank you all for giving your time. I know you all are extremely busy. And so just allocating these few hours to inform my students, the Holy Names community, and whomever else is a part of this event is a great feat in and of itself. And so again, thank you all for the time taken. Thank you for responding to my emails. And I do hope to continue these types of conversations and also these types of partnerships as well. All right, y'all have a good one, and I will be in touch for sure. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you everyone for joining us.
All right, good night.
Good night. Good night. Thank you, Kevin, for supporting. Have a good night.